The burlap smelled of wet rot and horse feed. That's what she breathed in while a drunk haggled over her life in the mud. Gideon didn't want a wife. He wanted winter salt. But the slow, defiant rise of her chest beneath that sack made him drop his coin pouch. The settlement at Bear Creek didn't have a proper name on most maps, and it didn't deserve one. It was an open wound in the territory, a collection of rotting canvas tents and raw lumber shacks that smelled of spilled rye whiskey, unwashed sheep's wool, and desperate men. Gideon Locke hated the place. He only came down from the timberline twice a year. Today, his boots sank ankle-deep into the cold, churning muck of the main thoroughfare. He carried the smell of the high country on him, pine pitch, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of dried blood from the elk he'd dressed out 3 days prior. He just wanted his salt, his flour, and enough rifle cartridges to ensure he wouldn't have to see another human face until the spring thaw. A roar of laughter echoed from the boardwalk outside the assayer's office. It wasn't the good kind of laughter. It was jagged, cruel. Gideon paused, adjusting the heavy canvas pack on his broad shoulders. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud and turned his head. A crowd of miners, trappers, and drifters had formed a loose, shifting ring. In the center stood a makeshift auction block, just 2 overturned crates. On the crates stood a woman, or at least the shape of one. She was swallowed by a filthy, oversized wool coat that hung past her knees, its hem caked in heavy clay. Her hands were bound in front of her with coarse hemp rope, but it was her head that held the crowd's jeering attention. A heavy burlap sack, the kind used for storing root vegetables, was yanked aggressively over her head and secured at her throat with a length of twine. Pacing in front of her was a man in a bowler hat that had seen better decades. He was sweating, despite the biting autumn chill, his face slick with grease and cheap liquor. "I'm telling you, she's strong enough for washing and mending," the man shouted, his voice cracking. "Bought her sight unseen from a broker back east. Paid good money. Broker said she was a beauty. He lied. I pull back the veil, and I tell you fellas, it's a face to curdle fresh milk. Hideous. A judgment from the Almighty." The crowd laughed. Someone threw a clump of wet sawdust. It hit the woman's shoulder. She didn't flinch. "She won't speak." "Look at you with that devil glare," the seller sneered, poking her in the ribs with a walking stick. The woman swayed but caught her balance. "So, I covered her up. Put the sack on her so I wouldn't have to look at the monstrosity while she cooked my beans. I'm just trying to recoup my losses. Who needs a strong back? You don't gotta look at the mantelpiece while you poke the fire, eh?" More laughter. Ugly scraping sounds in the damp air. Gideon felt a slow, grinding irritation build in his molars. He wasn't a savior. The frontier was built on broken things, and he had long ago decided he couldn't fix them. He survived by minding his own business, trusting only the steel of his knife and the silence of the snow. He took a step toward the general store. "Walk away," his instincts hummed. Then he looked back. The wind caught the coarse burlap, pressing it against her face. He saw the outline of her nose, the sharp angle of a cheekbone, but it was her hands that stopped him. Her knuckles, tied together, were stark white. They weren't trembling with terror. They were clenched into fists so tight the skin looked ready to split. She wasn't broken. She was furious. A massive, bearded miner with a missing ear stepped forward. Barton. Gideon knew him by reputation, a man who worked his mules to death and his women faster. "I got $4 and a silver watch," Barton grunted, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "I'll take the freak. Got a heap of laundry needs boiling at my claim. If she gets lippy, I'll just leave the sack on." "Sold," the seller practically shrieked, reaching for the watch. Gideon didn't think. The action bypassed his brain entirely, rooted in some deep, forgotten instinct that he usually kept buried under years of isolation. He stepped into the ring. His boots hit the boardwalk with a heavy, final thud. The crowd parted. Gideon was a large man, broad and weathered like the side of a canyon. His coat was made of wolf pelts, and his eyes were a pale, washed-out gray that made people uncomfortable. He didn't look at the woman. He looked at the seller. Gideon reached into his coat, pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch, and tossed it onto the crates at the woman's feet. It landed with a dense metallic clink. 3 half-eagles. Gideon's voice was gravel and low thunder. Gold. The seller stared at the pouch. then at Barton, then back at the gold. He lunged for the pouch, his greedy fingers snatching it from the wood. "She's yours, mountain man," the seller stammered, backing away quickly before Gideon could change his mind. "No returns. You bought her deaf, dumb, and ugly." Barton stepped up, his face flushing dark red. "Hey, Locke, I had the bid." Gideon turned his head slowly. He didn't drop a hand to the heavy revolver at his hip. He didn't need to. He just stared at Barton, letting the silence stretch until the ambient noise of the town seemed to fade away. "You want her, Barton?" Gideon asked softly. "Take her." Barton looked at Gideon's eyes. He looked at the wolf pelts. He spat on the ground and backed into the crowd. "Keep the ugly bitch. She'll freeze up there with you anyway." Gideon finally turned to the woman. She was perfectly still. Up close, he could hear the ragged, shallow breaths she was taking through the weave of the burlap. The smell of fear was entirely absent. Instead, he smelled dirt, cold sweat, and something faintly floral underneath the stench of the sack. He reached out and took hold of the coarse rope binding her wrists. He didn't say a word. He just tugged gently, leading her off the crates. She stumbled. He caught her by the elbow. Her arm felt thin through the heavy wool coat, but the muscle beneath was wire-tight. What the hell did I just do? Gideon thought, the adrenaline fading into a cold, heavy stone in his gut. $15 in gold, half his winter savings. For a woman wearing a potato sack. "Come on," he muttered, his voice rough. He led her through the mud toward the livery stable, ignoring the stares boring into his back. The transaction was over. The reality of it was just beginning. The ride up the mountain was brutal. Gideon rode his massive roan gelding, leading the pack mule. He had strapped the woman onto the mule's back, right between a sack of flour and a crate of canned peaches. She rode side saddle, her hands still bound. He hadn't cut the ropes yet. He hadn't removed the sack. He told himself it was because they needed to beat the incoming storm, that there was no time to stop. But the truth gnawed at him with every click of the mule's hooves on the rocky trail. He was stalling. He was terrified of what he had done, and terrified of what was under that burlap. A judgment from the Almighty, the seller had said. What if she was horribly disfigured? What if she was mad? Gideon lived alone because he liked things simple. Wood burned, meat sustained, snow buried. He understood the rules of the high country. He knew absolutely nothing about women, let alone one carrying the kind of trauma that required a hood. The air grew thin and biting. The muddy stench of Bear Creek gave way to the sharp, clean scent of spruce needles and ancient granite. The temperature plummeted. Gideon looked back over his shoulder. The woman sat rigid on the mule. The sack swayed slightly with the animal's gait. She hadn't made a single sound. Not a whimper, not a complaint about the cold, not a plea for her freedom. "We're almost there," he threw the words back at her, feeling foolish. His voice sounded loud and intrusive in the vast quiet of the mountains. She didn't nod. Dusk was bleeding into the sky, bruising it purple and black, when the silhouette of his cabin finally appeared. It sat nestled in a grove of ancient pines, a sturdy structure of peeled logs and river stone. It wasn't pretty, but it was impenetrable. Gideon dismounted, his joints popping from the cold. He tied the horses to the hitching post and walked over to the mule. He reached up and grabbed her by the waist. She stiffened instantly, a violent recoil. "Easy," he grunted, hoisting her down. "I ain't going to hurt you." Her boots hit the frozen dirt. She stood there, a strange, faceless monument in the twilight. Gideon pushed the heavy oak door of the cabin open. The interior was freezing, smelling of cold ash, dried leather, and old coffee. He struck a match against the doorframe, the sudden hiss and flare of sulfur cutting the gloom. He lit the oil lantern on the scarred wooden table. Amber light spilled across the room, illuminating the cast-iron stove, the single cot, the racks of pelts. "Step inside," he said. She walked over the threshold slowly, feeling her way with the toe of her boot, since her vision was obscured. Gideon shut the door against the wind. The silence inside the cabin was thick, almost suffocating. He walked over to the table and drew his hunting knife from its sheath. The steel hissed against the leather. The woman took a sudden step back, hitting the wall. Her chest began to heave. She thought he was going to kill her. "Stand still," Gideon said, his tone softening a fraction. though it still sounded like gravel rubbing together. "I'm cutting the ropes." He approached her slowly, raising his hands so she could see them through the bottom of the sack. He slipped the blade under the hemp rope at her wrists. With one quick motion, he severed it. She pulled her hands apart instantly, rubbing her raw, bleeding wrists. "Now the twine," he murmured. Gideon stepped into her personal space. He could feel the heat radiating off her shivering body. Up close, the smell of the burlap was overpowering. He slid the edge of the knife under the thick twine tied around her throat. He felt the rapid, terrified flutter of her pulse against his knuckles. Snip! The twine gave way. Gideon stepped back, lowering the knife. "Take it off." She hesitated. Her hands, shaking now, reached up. Her fingers gripped the rough fabric at the bottom of the sack. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising, and then, in one fluid motion, she pulled it up and off her head. The burlap fell to the floorboards with a soft, dusty thud. Gideon gasped. The sound was involuntary, a sharp intake of air that punched out of his lungs before he could stop it. He froze, his grip tightening on the handle of his knife. It wasn't because she was a monster. She stood under the harsh, flickering amber light of the lantern, chest heaving. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, tangled and wild. Her face was streaked with dirt and grime. But it was her face. She wasn't hideous. She possessed a striking, almost severe kind of beauty. High, sharp cheekbones that cast deep shadows, a strong jawline. But the feature that made the cellar scream freak, the thing that had caused the crowd to jeer, slashed across the left side of her face. It was a burn scar, massive, violently pink and silvery. It stretched from her left temple, down across her cheek, curling under her jaw. It drew the corner of her left eye down slightly, giving her a permanent, sorrowful asymmetry. But it was her eyes that made Gideon gasp. They weren't looking at the floor, they were locked onto his. One eye was a deep, rich brown. The other, framed by the scarred tissue, was a pale, icy blue. Heterochromia. The devil glare. Those eyes were a roaring fire of defiance, intelligence, and a bruised defensive pride. She looked at him not like a rescued victim, but like a cornered wolf, waiting for him to make the first move. She fully expected him to be disgusted. She expected him to laugh. She was bracing for the blow. Gideon realized he was staring. He realized his mouth was slightly open. He forced his jaw shut. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy. He looked from her scarred cheek to the pale blue eye, then down to the knife in his own hand. He felt entirely foolish. A profound, aching realization hit him. The men in town hadn't covered her face because she was ugly. They covered her face because her fierce, unblinking gaze and the physical proof of whatever hell she had survived made them feel small. They couldn't break her spirit, so they hid it. Gideon abruptly turned his back on her, driving the point of his hunting knife deep into the wooden tabletop. The times thwack times made her jump. "Sit down," he growled, walking toward the cast-iron stove and grabbing a handful of kindling. "Before you fall down." He didn't look back to see if she obeyed. He couldn't. His hands were shaking as he struck another match to light the fire. He had brought a storm into his cabin, and looking at her felt like staring directly into the sun. The cast-iron stove began to tick as the iron expanded. Heat bled into the freezing room, carrying the sharp, resinous tang of burning pine. Gideon kept his back to her. He fed another split log into the firebox, shut the iron door with a heavy clank, and adjusted the flue. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He was used to the methodical rhythm of isolation, skinning, smoking meat, chopping wood. There was no rhythm for this. He glanced over his shoulder. She was still standing exactly where he had left her, shivering violently. The oversized wool coat swallowed her frame, but it wasn't enough against the mountain chill seeping into her bones. Her mismatched eyes tracked his every micro-movement. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was waiting for him to demand his money's worth. "Sit," Gideon said. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the heavy wooden chair beside the table. She flinched at the sound of his voice, but she moved. She pulled the chair out slowly, the wood scraping loudly against the floorboards, and lowered herself onto the hard edge of the seat. She kept her spine rigid. Gideon walked to the dry sink. He grabbed a hunk of salt pork, a heavy knife, and an iron skillet. He moved with deliberate slowness, making sure she could see his hands at all times. He sliced the pork, the knife biting through the cured fat with a dull thud against the cutting board. He tossed the meat into the cold skillet and set it on the hottest part of the stove. Within minutes, the cabin filled with the rich, heavy smell of rendering fat. A loud, hollow rumble echoed in the quiet room. Gideon paused. He looked over. Josephine ducked her head, her unscarred cheek flushing dark red beneath the dirt. She clamped a hand over her stomach. Gideon didn't smile. He didn't offer empty sympathies. Pity was an insult on the frontier. Instead, he reached up to a shelf, grabbed a tin of dried white beans he'd soaked the night before, and dumped them in with the pork. They sizzled aggressively. He fetched 2 tin plates and a dented enamel coffee pot. He pumped water from the indoor hand pump, filled the pot, and slammed it onto the stove. He walked back to the table, setting a plate and a fork in front of her. Then, he reached into his deep coat pocket and pulled out a small, round tin. He slid it across the rough wood. It bumped against her plate. She stared at it. "What is that?" Her voice was a rasp. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across a stone, unused, defensive, and cracked with thirst. "Pine pitch and yarrow," Gideon grunted, taking his own seat across the table. He kept his distance. "For your wrists. The rope chewed them up. It'll stop the infection." She looked from the tin to his face. She didn't reach for it. "You aren't putting it on me?" Gideon let out a short, humorless breath. "I reckon you've had enough hands on you today. Do it yourself." A flicker of something crossed her pale blue eye. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. She reached out with trembling fingers, popped the lid off the tin, and scooped out a dollop of the strong-smelling green salve. She rubbed it gingerly into the raw, weeping skin of her left wrist. She hissed as it burned, but she didn't stop. "Josephine," she said softly, rubbing the salve into her right wrist. Gideon looked up from the table grain. "What?" "My name," she said, lifting her chin. The scar tissue pulled taut, catching the amber light of the lantern. "It's Josephine. Not freak, not ugly. Josephine." Gideon held her stare. He saw the sheer force of will it took for her to say it, to lay claim to herself in a stranger's cabin after being sold like livestock. He felt a sudden deep respect anchor itself in his chest. "Gideon," he replied. His voice was quieter now, a low rumble. "Food's almost ready, Josephine." She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. Then she looked down at the tin of salve. The tension in the room didn't vanish, but it shifted. It stopped being the tension of a predator and prey, and became the cautious, brittle silence of 2 stray dogs sizing each other up over a scrap of meat. The wind hit the cabin a little after 8 o'clock. It didn't arrive gradually. It slammed into the log walls with the force of a runaway freight train. The heavy timbers groaned. Snow began to lash furiously against the single, thick-paned window, piling up in the corners of the glass. Inside, the fire roared, fighting back the draft. They had eaten in silence. Josephine had consumed her pork and beans with terrifying speed, practically inhaling the food before catching herself and slowing down. Gideon had pretended not to notice, nursing his bitter black coffee. Now, he stood up and walked to the corner of the room. There was only one bed, a heavy wooden frame strung with rope, holding a mattress stuffed with dried moss and covered in thick bear and wolf pelts. Gideon grabbed a heavy wool blanket from a wooden chest. He threw it on the floor next to the stove. He unrolled his canvas sleeping pad over the floorboards. Josephine watched him from the table, her hands wrapped tight around her empty coffee tin. "You take the bed," Gideon said, not looking at her as he kicked his boots off. "No." The word was sharp. It cut through the howling wind outside. Gideon stopped, turning to look at her. "I ain't asking." "And I'm not taking your bed," Josephine shot back, her grip on the tin cup turning her knuckles white. She stood up, swaying slightly from exhaustion, but her stance was planted wide. "I know how this works. A man gives up his bed. He expects a visitor in the night. I'll sleep on the floor." Gideon felt a flare of anger, hot and fast, followed immediately by a heavy, suffocating wave of weariness. He rubbed a massive hand over his bearded face, exhaling a long, slow breath. "Listen to me," Gideon said. He didn't move toward her. He kept his voice flat and perfectly even. "I paid $15 in gold today because I hated the sound of that man's voice. I brought you up here because leaving you with Barton was a death sentence. That's it. Josephine stared at him, the pale blue eye narrowing. Nobody pays $15 for nothing. What do you want from me? Quiet, Gideon snapped back, though there was no malice in it. I want quiet. I live up here because the world down there is loud and ugly, and it takes things it has no right to take. He gestured vaguely toward her face, then quickly dropped his hand, cursing himself for the clumsiness. But Josephine didn't flinch. She just watched him, dissecting his words. You don't owe me anything, Gideon continued, his tone dropping back to a gravelly murmur. You stay here till the pass clears in May. You eat my food. You stay warm. Come spring, you walk down that mountain and you go wherever the hell you want. Until then, you take the bed because you look like a stiff wind would snap you in half, and I prefer the floor. He sat down heavily on his canvas pad, turning his back to her, and pulled the wool blanket over his shoulders. The wind shrieked against the logs. For a long time, there was no sound from her side of the room. Gideon stared at the flickering orange light escaping from the vents of the stove. He wondered if she was going to grab his hunting knife from the table and slit his throat while he slept. The thought didn't scare him, it just made him sad. Then he heard the soft rustle of fabric. He heard the heavy, cautious footsteps cross the floorboards. The bed frame let out a long, complaining creak as weight settled onto it. Gideon? Her voice came from the shadows in the corner of the room. It was tiny now, stripped of the defensive bark. Yeah, he answered the wall. It was a boiler explosion, she said. The words were rushed, tumbling out into the dark. In a textile mill back in Massachusetts, the foreman locked the doors so we wouldn't take breaks. I was closest to the valve when it blew. Gideon closed his eyes. He could smell the steam. He could hear the screams. He knew what men were capable of when money was on the line. Broker told the men in town I was cursed, she whispered. Said the fire marked me. Gideon turned over. He looked across the dark cabin. He could just make out the shape of her beneath the heavy pelts. It didn't mark you, Gideon said, his voice carrying through the cold air, thick with a fierce, quiet certainty. It tested you, and you're still breathing. Silence fell over the cabin again, but it wasn't the brittle, jagged silence from before. It was the heavy, settling quiet of snow covering muddy ground. He heard the deep, ragged breath she took, and then, for the first time since she had been shoved onto those crates in Bear Creek, he heard her cry. It wasn't a loud sob. It was a silent, shaking release, buried deep in the wolf pelts. Gideon didn't get up to comfort her. He knew better. She needed to bleed the poison out in her own territory. He simply closed his eyes, let the heat of the iron stove wash over his back, and kept watch while the storm raged outside. He had brought a woman to the mountain to die. Instead, he realized they were both finally going to live. Did Gideon's raw honesty grab your heart? The frontier is unforgiving, but sometimes the hardest souls harbor the deepest warmth. If you loved this gritty, emotional journey of survival and unexpected connection, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves a real, grounded Western romance. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We bring you intense, pulse-pounding dramatic tales every single week. Ring the bell so you never miss a chapter.